So welcome all to the session 3 of What Tells the Collection of COMCOL 2020. We had already a full packed afternoon, but there's more to come, so stay tuned. We just wait 2 minutes more for the people to arrive, and then Lane Byers, as moderator of this session, will take over, and I hope you will enjoy the next hour with some great presentations that are waiting for you.
Good evening, good morning, or good night. I'm really happy to welcome you at the next session of our COMCOL conference. And I really love the topic of this session because it's collection history. And I think it's important that we study collections, that we study their history, in order to reinterpret them, in order to reconnect them to society. We really have to know where these collections come from. And so our first speaker is Birger Helgestad. He's head of collection logistics at the Nordiska Museet in Sweden. Birger, I'm happy to give you the floor now.
Thank you. Let me start by sharing my screen. It's more interesting than my face, I'd say. I hope you can all see the first slide. So my name, as mentioned, was Birger Helgestad, and I work at Nordiska Museet, and we're based in Stockholm. And start by giving you a little bit of context. And as these sort of Zoom conferences, I really miss the audience, so I thought I'd start with a photo of lots of black and white men with mustaches, because that sets the tone, I hope. And I will first start by talking a little bit about Norden at the end of the 19th century. And the Nordic countries, or Norden, as we apparently are allowed to call it in English as well now, was not very unlike the rest of Europe. That was a bit important to mention. It wasn't a very exotic place in any way. There was some industrialization, but not a great deal. 1850, about 90% of people in Sweden lived off the land, and in 1900, about 75%. But still, the level of industrialization was enough to worry quite a few. And that's much due to the various forms of romanticism and those sort of thoughts that influence culture and understandings of society and traditions in country life. So it worried people, these changes that were taking place. And in this period, there was also a lot of reflection on the various nations' identity, their place in history, their place in the world, and also the relations to each other. And here we had something called pan-Scandinavianism, which is also a little bit important for our museum and our collections. And these are the ideas that at least the 3 Scandinavian countries that speak very similar languages and so on would do better without borders between them than with the borders. And this is a thought that had a lot of followers in this period, and I guess it has never quite gone away either. Maybe our museum are a bit representative of that in a way. And then another very important thing to mention is, of course, the dissolution of the Swedish-Norwegian Union that happened in 1905. And the photo I showed of, well, that's in the background of this slide as well, is from these discussions. I recognize the Norwegian Prime Minister there, at least. And these are some events that set the context for the founding of our museum. The other very important part is, of course, this very handsome chap, Arthur Hazelius. He's the founder of the museum. He was born in 1833 into a sort of an educated middle-class background. He was a scholar. He had a PhD in Nordic languages. And he was very well connected at the founding of the museum. Although publicly, he wasn't a very popular man at the time, because he was promoting reforms, not only to education, but also to grammar. He was suggesting that we should all try to merge these three languages into one, and such thoughts are never very popular. So he was more infamous than famous at the time he turned his attention to museums. And he was then very concerned with the loss of traditional culture and the impact of the modern world on the countryside. People changed their manner of dress, people started using new tools and that sort of thing. So he was very much a man of his time as well. So a bit of context is the museum itself, of course, because we're going to talk about collectors. And the museum was founded in 1873. Hazelius died in 1901, and the building, which you see in this picture, and which is the building I'm standing in now, opened in 1907. And it was very much a product of Hazelius' unique ambition. It was his museum. And as mentioned, at the same time as it was a very contemporary museum, it really suited a lot of the thinking at the time, with a focus on traditional folk culture in particular, on the region, recognizing that the borders doesn't mean all that much, and so on. And it was almost from its inception, it wasn't in this building from the very start, but from its inception, it had an impact and was a sort of important and very noticeable element in Sweden's cultural life. And I dare say it still is. It's notable that we are here. The collections came from throughout Sweden, from the Norden or the Nordic area, and from the areas formerly Swedish, because of course at times in history Sweden has been substantially larger in area than it is today, and what it ended up being in 1905. And another very important element of the identity of Nordiska Museet is the combination of the archives, the library, our photographs taken by our own photographers, and the objects. And this makes it uniquely fantastic, I think, just great to work here. And then on to the topic, done with the context. Skaffarna is the word that was used for these sort of agents, the collectors, in the first few decades. And there's pictures of 4 of them here. And let me see, here we got the names and a little bit of information about them. So the first one's on the left there is Bud Erik and Emma Olsson, this married couple. They were farmers from Dalarna in Sweden, which is a very nice region. They were long-term personal friends that Hazelius had met on his travels before he sort of turned his attention to museums in the 1860s, I guess. So he knew them very well, and they had a lifelong, frequent correspondence. And they collected for Hazelius and Nordiska Museet in the local community and also in the surrounding areas. They bought objects and they also received donations, which is, of course, something all museums quite enjoy. The next chap, the one in the middle here, Alexis Engdahl, he was a theology student, and his travels and expenses were paid by Hazelius, and he traveled throughout Sweden to collect, and he was exposed to all kinds of weathers and a lot of unpleasantness to acquire objects, and he was constantly running out of cash, had to borrow a coat there and sleep in a barn here, and he was often being quite low in spirits. We see in the letters he sent to Hazelius. And he had also hoped to become a permanent employee, which he never happened. Instead, he ended up taking up his theology studies again and becoming a pastor, I guess, at the end. What it had to do with his constant complaining, I don't know, but there might have been something in that. But he collected a great deal. The last person here on the right, Torjus Leifson, he met Hazelius in Norway when he was about 15, 16 years old. And he's the son of a farmer who was running a rather tough farm in steep hills and rocky terrain. And Hazelius wanted to acquire a chair from his father. And his father wasn't very excited about this, but he managed to convince the young boy to help him. And he ended up being absolutely captivated by Hazelius' ideas, and also very taken by Hazelius as a person, this very exotic person from the big city in Stockholm, which was very far away from the Norwegian countryside, and also fascinated by the museum. This we'll learn in the letters and the correspondence that took place later. So he was a convinced Nordiska Museum agent, and he then traveled throughout Norway collecting for Hazelius. Of course, this is in the period when Norway was still in the union with Sweden. So you have these three quite different, but at the same, doing the same sort of work for the museum, and all unpaid expenses paid, but otherwise unpaid volunteers. And what these agents did, Skaffan as we call them, as mentioned, generally unpaid volunteers. Some, as we see, worked in their local communities, gathering information and objects from their neighbors and friends and families. Some traveled extensively and exhaustingly throughout these regions in periods where it wasn't that easy and comfortable to travel. And they acquired objects, they made drawings, they gathered stories, they made descriptions of things, and had diverse observations. And an example is this drawing on the left of this slide, which was made by Alexis Engdahl. I don't know if all theology students at the time could draw that well, but maybe. And it's then of a farmhouse he observed. And all of this information then ended up in the museum. They also raised money and generated interest and publicity because Hazelius was aware of the importance of these two things as well, and was rather good at it. He was actually very good at it. Then how they were managed. Hazelius wrote an acquisition policy booklet already in 1872, detailing what sort of things they should look out for, what was important, that sort of thing. And this was, just as he was founding a museum. So take that spectrum. And this is rather good and interesting document, and was sent out then to all these Skaffan, all these agents. They had something to guide them a little bit. He also provided ideas and direction, for example, by sharing literature, books that sort of revealed his mindset about the task they were undertaking. He also invested heavily in personal relationships, and this is quite important, I think. He was affable and enthusiastic and persuasive, but he really made friends and stayed friends with huge amounts of people, which is very useful when you try to get money, publicity, and objects. And he mainly communicated them through letters. He had an extreme amount of correspondence, which of course we're very happy about, since we then can trace all of this within our archives. And on the slide here, there's also a picture of this acquisition policy from a page. So getting towards I think this is the very last slide. So the results of their endeavors. Our collection today holds about 1.5 million objects, and we have about 5,500 meters of archives, and about 6 million photos. So a sizable collection. The combination of the archives, the objects, the photographs, provide some quite unique relationships. So we can see we might have a chair, and we have the drawings and plans for how to produce or mass produce this chair. In our archives, in our library might have then the publications of selling this chair. And we have photos of people sitting in this chair. A very sort of banal example, but highlighting the power of having these different sources of information in one institution, so we can easily make these relationships that speaks for themselves and add information to the whole. And the very well directed, but at the same time very individual perspectives of the various agents provided then unique insights and understandings. And I would then say that these understandings and insights you wouldn't have if you had a group of well-trained museum professionals. So we get something that's added to it. And I would also argue that this is then an excellent as a starting point for producing rich and relevant and contextual and interconnected collections where the relationships provide information in addition to the objects and the various collections in themselves. And I think I've talked for just about 15 minutes, and I think I'm at the very last slide. So that was all I had to share with you.
Yeah, Burger, this was perfect in terms of timing and also very interesting. We travel now to Tatarstan to Gulnaz Zigan-Girova. She's a researcher, and she will talk about the writer and also collector, I guess, Eskamal, and it's again a collection history. And Gulnaz will speak in Russian, and Tanya is there to translate. This might take us a little bit more time, but this is maybe time to think about questions. And we will see if we need a lot of time. We will move the discussion to after the 4 papers, because the next session, our 2 speakers are already present, and it's an ethics topic, but we can maybe combine the discussion. If everything goes well, we can still discuss these 2 papers. So I'm happy now to give the word to Gulnaz.
Thank you. Good morning. Мемориальные коллекции. Мемориальные коллекции как собрание предметов, связанных... Эти презентации, да.
Just a moment to switch on the presentation.
Sorry. Yes, sir?
Can I also say something before we start? I'm Christiane, I'm in charge of the technical stuff. Everybody can, your Zoom bar, you can activate the translation. There should be an interpretation button. You can change, you can choose the language. Thank you.
Итак, можно... I begin? Мемориальные коллекции, как собрание предметов, связанных с определенным человеком, являются наиболее распространенной формой собрания историко-литературных музеев.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. My topic is devoted to memorial collection, and the memorial collection is a collection of objects that are associated with a certain person and is the most widespread form of the collection for historical and literary museums.
Можно выделить основные принципы и интерпретации мемориальной коллекции. Во-первых, подлинность музейных объектов.
So we can mark out and distinguish the main principles of interpretation for memorial collections. So these are as follows. First of all, that is the authenticity of museum items.
Демонстрация оригинальности различных представителей общества.
And as well, demonstration of some peculiar character features of distinguished representatives of society.
содействие самоопределению личности,
promoting the self-determination and self-representation of some outstanding persons,
и воспитание положительных ценностей.
as well as fostering some positive values.
Шариф Камал, татарский писатель, он является классиком национальной литературы.
Sharif Kamal is a writer backed in Tatarstan, Russia, and he considered to be a classic of Tatar literature.
Музей, посвященный Шарифу Камалу, был открыт в Казани в 1944 году.
So the museum that is devoted to Sharif Kamal was opened in Kazan, that is the capital of Tatarstan Republic of Russia, in 1944.
Коллекция Шарифа Камала была передана в музей из семьи писателя.
So the museum collection for the museum as it is was given by the members of his family.
Но коллекция и сейчас пополняется. Сотрудники музея проводят исследовательскую работу по сбору материалов Шарифа Камала.
But even nowadays, the collection is even becomes wider and wider, and museum staff is constantly working on the research process to promote the collection better way and do their best.
Вы можете увидеть основные даты с биографии Шарифа Камала.
Here on the slides, you may see the key points and key dates of life of Sharif Kamal.
Он прожил долгую жизнь и очень большое творческое наследие оставил после себя.
He lived a very long life and was successful to create a huge pile of his writing, works and pieces.
Родился Шариф Камал в 1884 году. На фотографии вы можете видеть изображение этой деревни.
Sharif Kamal was born in 1844, and here on the slide you may see the picture of his native Tatar village.
Он родился в семье среднезажиточного татарина.
He was born in a family of a moderately prosperous Tatar family.
В 1944 году сотрудники музея организовали специальную экспедицию на родину писателя, и тогда была сделана данная фотография.
So, as far as in 1944, the museum staff made a special expedition to the homeland of the writer, and this particular picture was taken in 1944.
Шариф Камал родился далеко от центра Республики Татарстан. Деревня находится в 4-50 километрах от Казани.
So Sharif Kamal was born in a very distant village from the capital of Tatarstan Republic. It is located in 450 kilometers from the very center of the republic, so it is a very distant place.
Согласно национальным традициям, Шариф Камал с юности стремился получить образование.
According to the national tradition, Sharif Kamal was very eager to get a really proper education.
Закончив на родине, он учился в университете в Стамбуле и 1 год в Каире, в Египте.
So after graduating from a Muslim primary school in his homeland in Tatarstan, Russia. He studied at the University of Istanbul, and then he spent 1 year in Cairo, Egypt.
Потом он возвращается в Россию, в Петербург.
After that, he was back to Russia and came to St. Petersburg.
И в Петербурге была издана первая книга Шарифа Камала, которая называлась «Голос».
So in St. Petersburg, the first collection of poems that is called Shade, that can be translated like The Voice, was published.
В Петербурге Шарифу Камалу помогал его старший брат, который жил в этом городе, был знаком со многими видными деятелями культуры того времени, которые жили в Петербурге.
His elder brother, who lived in St. Petersburg, supported him a lot, and he was really acquainted with many prominent culture figures of that time.
На слайде можно видеть изображение газеты «Нур», «Свет», в одном из номеров которых было издано стихотворение Шарифа Камала.
So here on this slide, you may see a picture of newspaper that is called Nur, that means light, and that is the very newspaper when the first piece of poem by Sharif Kamal was published.
Эта газета была одной из самых первых в России мусульманских газет на татарском языке.
So this newspaper is proud to be the one and the first newspaper that was published in the Tatar language and was devoted to Muslim Tatar traditions.
Затем Шариф Камал живет более 15 лет в городе Оренбурге.
Then he moved to the city of Orenburg in the north of Russia, and he had been living there for 15 years.
Здесь он пишет свои самые знаменитые произведения, среди которых рассказ «Окшарлаклар».
One of the most prominent pieces by Sharif Kamal were created over there, and one of them is the piece that is called Asharlaklar, that means seagulls.
Книга автобиографична, как и многие другие произведения писателя. В нем рассказывается о рабочих, наемных, которые по всей России трудились, и татары, которые жили во многих регионах России.
So the book has many biographical features by the writer himself and is devoted to the life of Tatars as a hired workers who were really popular and worked all over the Russia in very enormous Russian regions, in many of them.
В 1925 году Шариф Камал приезжает в Казань и работает в системе народного образования.
In 1925, Sharif Kamal came to Kazan and started working in the system of public education.
В Казани Шариф Камал пишет еще одно свое произведение «Когда рождается прекрасное», где рассказывает о революционных событиях среди татарского населения.
So, here in Kazan, Sharif Kamal writes another famous piece that is called Matur Daganda, and that means when the beautiful and the beauty is born, and that novel is devoted to revolutionary events that were really significant events among the Tatars as well.
После смерти писателя в 1942 году в его квартире создается мемориальный музей.
After the death of the writer in 1942, a memorial museum was created in his apartment.
Гостевую комнату этого музея можно увидеть на изображении.
So here on the slides you can see one of the rooms of this house, and it was considered to be a living room.
В экспозиции также можно увидеть документы, фотографии и личные вещи Шарифа Камала.
The collection of museum also displays a memorial collection by personal items by Sharif Kamal.
В заключение хотела сказать, во-первых, коллекция Шарифа Камала единственный наиболее полный архив татарского творческого интеллигента начала XX века, сохранившийся в фондах музея.
To make a conclusion, I would like to emphasize the key points of my presentation. The Sharif Kamal collection is the only one and the most complete archive of the Tatar creative intellectual of the early 20th century that is preserved in the museum's fund.
Уникальность материалов заключается еще и в том, что это комплексная коллекция, в которой собраны и письменные, и художественные, и историко-бытовые предметы.
The unique features of the collection is the following ones. The collection is really versatile and includes both written and artistic, historical, and household items.
Эта коллекция, хранящаяся в Национальном музее, является частью национального наследия, которое представляет всему миру неповторимое своеобразие культуры татарского народа и сохраняет ценности этой нации.
The materials that are held and preserved in the museum collection are the part of the National Museum of Tatarstan, and they really reflect the cultural and unique features of Tatar culture and represent them to the world, and that is a really distinguishing thing. Thank you so much. You're welcome to ask any questions.
Thank you, Gulnaz. We cannot travel to Kazan, but I'm happy that with your paper and also the previous paper, at least we get an impression of collections there and of the way they were collected. I think it may be nice to move to the next two speakers. In both of the next speakers also deal with collecting, but with ethics of collecting. And I think for the discussion, it would be important both for you, Birger, and for Gulnaz to also reflect on the ethics of these former collectors. So I think we can do the discussion all together, and I'm happy to move now to South Korea and to the National Museum of Korean Contemporary History, where Jung Ha will be presenting about ethical, theoretical, and realistic issues found in collection-based museum research.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And
you want to
can you
share your
see?
screen?
Yes. Can you see my slide?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oops. Okay. How about,
Yes.
can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. Thank you. I'm Jung-Ok from South Korea. I would like to thank moderator, Dr. Lee Myers, for her kind introduction and invitation to this session. My presentation is about museum research, examining its importance and ethical issues, and finally discussing realistic difficulties faced by curators, faced by this museum field. Museum research in this presentation refers to that conducted by museum curators around the collections, rather than all general research conducted in the museum. Museum research can be divided into a number of categories. Alexandra Bonia divided it into 4 categories, citing double research. The first is based on the museum's collections and relics, heavily on the disciplines connected to the content of the museum. The second involves science and disciplines pursued in order to develop tools for museum practice. The third type of research aims to stimulate thought about the museum as an institution and takes place at a more theoretical and philosophical or museological level. The fourth type is also museological. In this presentation, my discussion is limited to the first category, research based on the museum's collection. I work at the National Museum of Korean Contemporary History in South Korea. Hereinafter, I will call the NMKCH. The NMKCH is the first national museum of contemporary history in South Korea and opened in December 2012. Since its opening, most of research has been conducted by external researchers, mostly from universities, on issues of contemporary history, meaning it falls under the third category of museum research mentioned earlier. At the NMKCH, the research division where I am working began research on museum collections in 2019. The first time the NMKCH has conducted such research led by curators. The materials studied in 2019 include the first radio produced in South Korea in 1959, and a thank you letter from a Korean war orphan to a sponsor in 1950, and a modern travel brochure for mountain Kumgang during the Japanese colonial period, and documents on the government's economic development plan in 1960. In 2020, research continues around the new materials. Research conducted by curators around the museum collections, which began in 2019, initiated with a reflection on research conducted by external researchers on issue of contemporary history. The key reflection was that no matter how much the accumulated research results amount to, the expertise of NMKCH museum curators will not improve because they are not the ones doing the research. The research findings were also not effectively connected to NMKCH exhibit, which are the museum's core business. Exhibits are mainly possible out of museum collections, but in a situation where research on museum collections has not accumulated, there were many limits in directly connecting theoretical research on issues in contemporary history to exhibits. Therefore, my presentation will discuss the motive for curators to start research on museum collections and ethical and realistic issues faced by the curators during their research. The first issue is the importance of museum research, especially of curator responsibility and professionalism, and that research is not the only important museum project. In terms of the responsibility of museum curators, the importance of museum research has been recently emphasized in museum-related codes of ethics or codes of conduct. In particular, the research and interpretation of museum collections are considered important professional capabilities that museum curators should have. One can see this in the following many codes of ethics. The second issue is research ethics. Here, I will particularly focus on conflicts of interest. Research ethics has become a familiar term as the scandals such as plagiarism and data manipulation in science research have been reported in the last decades. The meaning can be summarized as the integrity of research. It is necessary to honestly and faithfully present methods and data used without omission or additions during presentation of the research. This principle of integrity also applies to authors' notations and the necessity of writing research notes while engaging in the research process. Conflicts of interest can occur while engaged in research. For example, doctors should not be encouraged their patients to participate in their clinical research or to donate materials from their bodies for research. In other words, the interest of a doctor who should provide the best treatment to his or her patients differ from interest of a researcher who should obtain appropriate research materials, and situation should not be allowed to occur where they may conflict. In museum codes of ethics or codes of conduct, conflict of interest refers to the principle of putting the public interest or public good before personal interest or personal advantage. For example, the Code of Ethics for Curators of the American Association of Museums states, curators respect the public purpose of museums and conduct themselves in a manner by putting the public interest first and doing personal profit rather than the public good constitutes a conflict of interest. As such, in museum, curators pursuing their own advantage through their status is a problem, and most commonly involves the purchase or sale of museum collections. So then, do conflicts of interest also occur in museum research? A conflict of interest in museum research, which I want to talk about in this presentation, refers to the conflict over priority between the mission of curators to open museum collections to the public and increase access, namely transparency, and the mission to research museum collections. Museum collections are officially registered after going through some process. In addition, the photos and basic information of collections at the NMKCH where I work are open on the website, this www.emuseum.go.kr. After the registration process, anyone can request access to these collections when they visit museum. However, many of the museum collections have not yet gone through the registration process and are not therefore open to the public. If that's the case, before the collections are open to the public, can museum curators engage in research on those collections and publish academic papers in their own names? In other words, when others do not have access to the collections and do not even know they exist. Although it is a rather rare case, though it has happened more than a few times at other institutions in the meantime. Sometimes an employee of a public institution, a museum or public research institution, conducts his or her research on artifacts and publishes the findings as an academic paper before those artifacts are open to the public. Such a case is regarded as a conflict of interest because sometimes those who work at public institutions deliberately postpone the disclosure of artifacts so as to be able to publish their research papers first. The worst case is that they moved to universities or other institutions with their published papers. Therefore, in South Korea, some researchers outside the museum, typically those at universities, argue that museum employees should not conduct research on artifacts that are not open to the public. In this case, a conflict of interest can occur, which means that the interest of museum employees who should open artifacts to the public as soon as possible for the public good can conflict with the interests of museum employees who want to study the artifacts. The issue has never yet been dealt with in museum-related codes of ethics or codes of conduct. In other words, it has been said that as museum research is important and is emphasized as at the core of curator responsibility and professionalism, it should be conducted. But no one says some research should not be conducted. Then, in the interest of transparency for museum collections, should curators prioritize the disclosure of specific information over that documents, or should they put research first? This was the first question we faced when NMKCH began research on its museum collections in 2019. The last issue is a realistic one. Which one is priority given to museum research? Even for museums with a longer history than the NMKCH, research on their collections puts a heavy burden on curators in practical terms. Almost no museum has enough personnel needed due to their limited financial resources. Therefore, it is not easy to prioritize museum research over daily administrative tasks or more visible tasks such as displaying exhibitions, holding educational or academic events and performances, and publishing. As a result, it becomes necessary for curators to carry out research on their own times, and the resulting workloads lead them to avoid engaging in it. Yes, conclusion. We have reviewed the importance of museum research and ethical and realistic issues so far. In terms of the importance of museum research, general and universal codes of ethics published by ICOM or museum associations around the world are also necessary. However, in addition to such somewhat declarative codes of ethics that emphasize the importance of museum research, more specific and unique codes of ethics and research that embody realistic conditions and the needs of each museum are needed. Regarding conflicts of interest in museum research, a principle is needed that intersects the results of a discussion on existing research ethics, mainly in the science fields, with those on conflicts of interest in museums. Okay, it's over. Thank you.
Thank you, Jörg. Armando Perla earlier today said that power in institutions, for instance, institutional racism, is very subtle. And sometimes it is really very subtle in the sense that knowledge is not shared, or that some people can do research and that a wider network or wider communities cannot access collections. So I think this is interesting to debate further. But I'm very looking very much forward to the last speaker, Dola Murleys, studying at University of Sydney, Australia, but active as cultural historian, writer, and museologist. And I think, Dola, that your paper is really about power also. So I'm happy to give you the floor now.
Thank you very much, Talene, and to my fellow speakers. I'll just share my screen. All right. In Australia, it's customary to begin a public event or meeting with an acknowledgement to country, in which we pay our respects to Australia's First Nations peoples, and we acknowledge their custodianship and continuing connection to country. It's a statement that speaks of respect and dignity, and as a non-Indigenous person, it asks me to pause to consider the colonial heritage of my country and the legislation and the events which have shaped the lives of the Indigenous people of Australia since colonisation. It promotes an awareness of the past, the present, and the connection to the future, but it also reminds us of the fluidity of memory and that the capacity to forget is perhaps the most haunting trait of our species. Museums in this regard play a key role in the preservation and protection of our cultural heritage and identity. But while we think of museum collections as time capsules for posterity, our external memory banks, if you like, few beyond those of us on the inside realize that thousands of objects worth millions, hundreds of millions of dollars have been lost, stolen, misplaced, damaged, accidentally discarded or transferred, or officially classified as unlocated. The real scale of these missing items is unknown, yet if a key function of the museum is to guard against anticipated loss, it creates a paradoxical situation where museums nervous about reputational damage and reluctant to publicize their own failures rarely speak about the disappearance or misplacement of priceless objects, artifacts and artworks that are integral to their collections. Museums have a responsibility to consider the ethical dimensions of their collecting methods, but they also have a responsibility to acknowledge and account for loss, not simply within the institution, but the loss to community and to cultures, particularly when it pertains to objects that are sensitive in nature, including human remains and sacred and non-sacred objects from across the world. Stephen Lubauer from Brown University describes the study of this phenomenon as museum taphonomy, the process by which collections disappear. With many cultural institutions burdened with a profusion of artifacts, many of which will never be displayed, how do and should museums deal with loss? Should we continue to accumulate when we can't account for what we have? And with the very real responsibility, and with the very real possibility that many museums may not survive the impact of COVID-19, it will not be simply a matter of closing the doors and turning off the lights. Disposal or the dissolution of collections implies a loss of context, of history, and of our collective cultural heritage. While the abstract said 2 case studies, given the time constraints, I'm only going to explore the life of one missing object and ask what it means when objects are separated from the information about them, their stories, and their metadata. Do they lose much of their value, connection, and legacy? And what is the museum's responsibility in acknowledging loss? Museums hold both objects and stories are even more easily displaced than artifacts. Objects are both witnesses to the past and present, and my research approaches these questions through the concepts of time and memory, raising greater questions about the role of collecting institutions in preserving and storing the tens of millions of items held in their trust, as well as helping us to understand that loss is intrinsic in the formation and processing of collections, reminding us not only of the fragility and ephemeral nature of things, but challenging assumptions about and notions about permanence. I would also like to note that the material presented in my case study is of a culturally sensitive nature. I provide it in an historical context, and it has been published, but it may cause sadness or distress, particularly for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders. In 2015, as director curatorial exhibitions at Sydney's Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, I invited artist Brooke Andrew to develop a major immersive installation that incorporated our collection as a response to the exhibition Disobedient Objects organised by the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The exhibition and the installation were to be shown simultaneously. Andrew is a multidisciplinary artist. He's descended from the Wiradjuri people of southeastern Australia, as well as being of Scottish descent. His practice and artistic process incorporates photography, installation, museum interventions, and public and interactive artworks. As described by curator Katie Dyer, Andrew creates meanings through harnessing artifacts and often uses contemporary interpretations of the traditional Wiradjuri language and motifs of his mother's ancestors as an implicit critique of dominant power structures. Titling his installation Evidence, Andrew wove together unexpected and often overlooked objects and materials from the museum's collections with specially commissioned artworks to weave a story of social change, of resistance, and the struggle for right and liberties. His investigations and repurposing of material was a form of subversion from the inside, imbuing the museum's objects with an idiosyncratic personal vision and ignoring the myth of neutrality or long-held traditions that so long have formed the backbone of museum practice. In Andrew's words, my approach to evidence was experimental, a question of how far does the artist push and pull against the might of the museum to provide different access to objects while still maintaining an artistic sensibility. It means that risks need to be taken with the display and interpretation. The potency of his installation lay in its juxtaposition and collating of seemingly disconnected objects, such as a syringe container, provision opium, an Australian Army Service revolver with a water rat fur coat, love tokens, and engraved breastplates, symbolizing respectively substance abuse, conflict, cruelty to animals, and colonialism. These items were positioned alongside poignant documents such as the Aborigines Protection Board Annual Report of 1887 and photographs of Aboriginal people from the 19th century, who, as Katie Dyer writes in her catalogue essay, were unlikely to have granted permission to be photographed. And for that reason, I haven't included those photographs. Over about a period of a year, Andrew met and worked with the museum staff to research the collection and to go through the museum's collection stores, peeling back layers, uncovering stories of long dormant objects. Connections were made, interactions and relationships were researched, and new possibilities were opened up, as yet others petered out. One of those was an entry in an 1898 collection inventory of animal products. Handwritten in ink and sandwiched between a listing for turtle eggs and a perch is E2286, the tanned skin of a Tasmanian Aboriginal female. The starkness of this entry belies its shocking, distressing, and deeply disturbing nature. The disrespect to the individual, to the dead, to the cultural sensitivities of the originating community, and the inherent racism are indisputable. Research undertaken by the museum at the behest of the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre in 2006-07 reveals that a 1939 stocktake failed to account for her remains, and they have been missing from the museum's collections ever since. All that is left is the collection record. And I should note that further research would need to be undertaken to understand how her skin came into the museum's collections. Andrew's decision to exhibit the inventory as a form of memorial was also a sharp reminder that the museum needed to acknowledge and confront its past, and that we were not simply dealing with the loss of property. Discussions with colleagues, community members, and staff about appropriate methods of display led to the stockbook being covered by a form of shroud, and you can see the covering in the image. The physical act of lifting the shroud required, as curator Katie Dyer noted, a concerted decision to look deeper and unearth the evidence Andrew had chosen for our consideration, in fact, for reconsideration. For Andrew, covering objects is one way of dealing with the politics of representation, of complex ways of viewing, and of how we unpack and interpret stories, traumatic histories, and the rules of engagement. Should they be seen or shouldn't they? While some members of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community felt understandably that it was a sensitive matter that should not be referenced in the context of an exhibition, others, such as Andrew and Professor Ian Anderson, an Aboriginal Tasmanian and now Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the Australian National University, believe that history shouldn't be hidden. And I quote from Professor Anderson: "A stockbook entry of this nature is not an unemotive, passive, fading record. It is traumatizing, a hurtful reminder of a time when colonists considered Aboriginal Tasmanians as stock, possessions, and curiosity. It is witness of an inhumane disregard and cruelty. One perhaps understandable response is to bury the evidence in the back of the archives, leave the pain in the past. But that risks the truth-telling that is so necessary if we are to confront the history of Australia with authenticity and honesty. Revealing the evidence of colonial violence is never pain-free and never free of the risk that comes with such honesty. For the museum, it was an acknowledgement that we had to become more responsive to the changing socio-political agendas and to adopt a greater degree of social responsibility, empowering individuals and communities, as well as making new meanings for our collections in a contemporary context. We understood that while for some it might be perceived as offensive, for others it was liberating. In this sense, the dichotomy for museums and their collections is that we are forgetting in order to remember. Loss is intrinsic in the formation and development of collections. As museum professionals, we are instilled with the notion that there is no level at which loss is acceptable, that our collections are immutable and unchanging, or as one commentator Riley noted, museum curators have only one way of thinking: everything goes in, but nothing comes out. But the loss of some 20 million artifacts in a devastating fire that ravaged the National Museum of Brazil in 2018 reminds us that everything in our world is ephemeral and arbitrary. Loss can be painful and profound. We imbue objects with meaning, with love, with our hopes, our aspirations, and our ambitions. A sentimental gift, a souvenir reminder of a memorable experience, a love token, memento mori, or a talisman designed to protect the bearer and ward off evil. Objects are bridges to other people, places, and times, creating meaningful collections for their owners. And museums and their staff, as custodians and caretakers of our heritage, are not immune to imbuing their collections with value beyond their monetary worth. But with the privilege and access that comes with being the custodians of these great collections comes great responsibility. There are other voices silenced, overlooked, and ignored, different perspectives to consider and different ways of seeing. while as curators we might weave together the narrative, it is the artists, the donors, the community, the experts, the makers, and the custodians who interrogate and offer different ways of interpreting objects and their history beyond the institutional. Our collections are evidence of our interconnectedness, while their relevance is now too often eclipsed in an era when our interactions are dominated by social media, virtual reality, cancel culture, and vicarious experiences. But we are also at this time seeing a renewed sense of cultural awareness, of kinship and connection and relationship to the environment. But the threats are multiple and growing: identity politics, populist governments, climate change, pandemics, overpopulation, and accelerated urbanization. These are not isolated issues and are debated and questioned on a global scale. As Richard Sandel and Robert Janes observes, museums have increasingly sought to take on contemporary social justice related issues and to take up particular moral standpoints in place of seemingly neutral and objective commentary. Museums as public institutions, and I quote, are morally and intellectually obliged to question, challenge, or ignore the status quo and officialdom wherever necessary. With the exception of museums, there are few, if any, social institutions with the trust and credibility to fill this role. Museums are not neutral spaces. They carry their own biases and prejudices, not least being if they want to genuinely decolonize a museum, experience of the empire and its legacies from multiple perspectives, they must be prepared to engage in meaningful and genuine dialogue about repatriation, restitution, and sovereignty. As Andrew noted in a conversation I recently had with him, the issue of decolonization is that it is in danger of being led by the colonists, the colonizers. Museums must also take risks and be brave as institutional independence is increasingly eroded by populist and nationalist political agendas. In inviting Andrew to work with museums, we understood that while not everyone would be comfortable with his approach, as an institution, we were an accomplice, explicitly and implicitly supporting his right to tell the story in the way he saw fit, while also understanding that his investigations into our archives offered evidence about the very system that collected, preserved, as well as lost them. What are the legacies of all of these lost objects? Why are they relevant to museum audiences? Like Franz Kafka, I'm drawn to this idea of absence, to explorations of invisible curiosities. Absence implies a monochromatic mediation on grief, alienation, and loss. But for your curator, absence, for curators and researchers, absence is also a lost opportunity, an opportunity to fill the gaps. The clues may be insubstantial and fragmented, threads that knot, loop and unravel, but ultimately stitch together our memories, fears and hopes, and our collections are a hope and gateway into individual and communal stories. And I leave the last words to Brooke Andrew, who, he asks, is telling the right story. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. It's a heavy topic, I very much have in my head now this everything goes in, nothing out. And you can imagine that museum workers have a lot of excuses for this. No time, no money. The truth is, in fact, that also in my museum, we sort of sit on a richness of culture and do not share this enough. And if such a sensitive objects as parts of bodies have been lost, that's cruel. I hope we can get back also to the first two speakers, Birger and I think Tanya is leaving. Is Gulna still there? I don't see her.
Yeah, sorry, I was just very curious and interested in the topic. That's why I'm still listening, if I may.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Is Gulnaz still there?
Unfortunately, no.
No. Then I want to get back to Birger maybe with a question on ethics. If you look at Hazelius, would you think that we can learn something from his ethical behavior, or can we be very critical about this? How do you look at this? Because you have studied him and his networks, and of course we could talk a lot about one-sidedness of the way and what he collected, but if you look at the ethics.
Yeah, well, there's several aspects that are interesting in terms of ethics. Of course, it was a very competitive collection in this period. So that might have produced behaviors that weren't very good, and they criticized each other for bad behavior and behaving rather unethically towards the people they were collecting from. So paying way too little for something. Another interesting aspect is the movement of both information and objects, and then out of their context across borders, and that is made more relevant by that some of these borders have appeared in a way after the museum was founded. So it was natural for a Swedish institution to collect in Norway before 1905 because it was part of the Union, shared a king and that sort of thing. But of course, suddenly you have a border there. What do you do then? And this is even more topical with indigenous people living in this region that has never really had a strong relationship to the borders. So Sami people, for example, live across the borders of these countries and move in and out. And should then, where should these collections be? Our museum has the biggest Sami collections anywhere in the world, and Stockholm has never had anything to do with Sami culture as such. But where should a big Sami National Museum be, for example, since it would be a place, it could never be right in a way. So there's several of these issues that are super interesting and well worth reflecting upon. And we can also trace the practices and how the thinking around this has changed during the century, where at times the big museums in the different countries have swapped collections. So Nordiska Museet have on long-term loan, for example, Norwegian folk costumes to the Norwegian Folk Museum. That makes sense to have folk costumes from the whole region in this museum, and at the same time, it sort of makes sense that they should be in the Norwegian Folk Museum, providing a bit more context. And then again, geographically, it might be from somewhere in Norway that is closer almost to Stockholm than to Oslo and that sort of thing. So there's loads of these aspects that are well worth reflecting upon, and there's a lot to take away from. And of course, with these big deposits, as in elsewhere, at least in Europe, it's a topic for many museums. What do we do with them? We have big collections that formerly belong to other museums, and should we, spend money on keeping them, or should we return them? And what was the thinking of doing these exchanges between the museums in the first place, and what makes the most sense, and so on. So,
does your museum has a large Sami collection?
Yes, we do actually have the largest Sami collection of any museum.
Yeah, because that's a big debate. I think not.
Not necessarily. Depends who you talk to, of course. But the approach is different in all the regions. Like Finland, for example, has now set up a national Sami museum. So the National Museum in Finland, in Helsinki, are sending their Sami objects to this new Sami museum. In Norway, they have several sort of regional Sami museums they tend to send objects to. And here too, there are some, of course. There's various approaches to this. There isn't a right or wrong, of course. It could also be where you separate out the culture and make it clear that this bit of culture is different from the rest. But by having them in the same museum, you might communicate that, you know, this is part of everything. This is part of our culture, the collective culture. So there's thinking on this. It's not something I have dealt with as such. It's just different discussions and different approaches, and it's very interesting, and of course something that is thought about and discussed. Whether it's a burning issue, I do not know. I do not think so.
Maybe Dola can add to this, but we are not going to discuss very long because we still need some energy for the mingling session. But Dola, can you maybe tell a little bit, do you work in a museum? Yes, I've done, you're talking about this project of and the artist book Andrews. Is this in the museum where you work, or?
It was.
Oh, okay.
So when I was working at the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, which I left a couple of years ago, when I was the director of curatorial, one of our approaches in dealing with the museum's big indigenous collections was to invite artists in to reinterpret and recontextualize the collections outside of the kind of traditional confines of museum practice. And it was a way of making the museum really rethink its collections and have a different way of seeing them, a different approach, different eyes, a different lens. I think a lot of what we're talking about when it comes around these issues of colonization and these collections, it's also, I think, a question of language. And I think we need to start thinking more about talking about ourselves as, when we're talking about our collections, not as owners, but as custodians or caretakers. And I think there needs to be a different language that we use around this notion of ownership of all of the cultural material, particularly when it comes to, in Australia, Indigenous material, or in New Zealand, Maori material. I think there needs to be different models of ownership that we need to approach and we need to discuss openly and with authenticity.
Custodians and as Armando said earlier, not collectors, but museum workers who share knowledge about collecting and caring for heritage. So it's about different languages and different worlds. We have to we can think about. Or maybe is it for you? I'm sorry, is your first name Ha? Because sometimes this is written. What?
My first name is Jong Ok.
Ah, okay. So then it's written in the correct way. Maybe you, because you're very much into ethics and looking at ethics of the museum world today, you can reflect on what Birger said about this Sami and other collections in his museum and the project Dola did with about this lost object. What were your thoughts about this?
Excuse me?
What was your thinking about? Is, for instance, about the fact that museums sort of are responsible for the loss of objects, but also loss of wider heritage and culture.
Yes. Nowadays, museum has faced the issues. Which value, for example, social inclusion or professionalism or transparency and etc. Which values should museum prioritize other than? For example, about my presentation, nowadays museum has been requested by publics more and more open collections or information about collections. I think rather than research on collections. So, and especially the researchers of other institutions, for example, universities, they very strongly argue that museum employees should work about the opening the collections rather than research. But many codes of ethics or codes of conduct emphasize the importance of research by museum curators. Yes, it is our tasks to resolve.
Of course, information about is only there because there has been done research.
Yeah, right.
The question is, who should do this research? Should only museum workers do this, or a wider network of society? And thinking about these undocumented objects where Donna refers to, maybe research and information would have saved them and would have enabled also to give them back to communities or to reinterpret them.
Yes.
So I'm a defender of research, but not the research only of museum workers.
Yeah, documenting is a very critical issue. For example, on the documents, when they were disclosed in the website, only their title and covers are open to the public, but the details remain undisclosed.
Yeah, that's
so external researchers, outside the museums argues that more information should be opened before research in detail by curators. So our time is very limited, and so should we curators to open more information about the documents, or to research about the documents?
It's an open question, and it depends really also on the type of collections also. But in our museum, the collection is online, and objects have been researched. You have a lot of information. If it has not been done, the information is limited. But in our museum, we had a discussion, for instance, about the provenance information. Now, of course, we invest a lot in doing research on provenance and in putting this online. And this is really collection yeah, research
Right.
on collections
Right.
itself, but it can be very important for yeah, doing restitution for new in a new way with objects and yeah. Okay, very interesting. I hope we can continue to talk with each other in the mingling sessions. I see still, it's not really a question, but a chat for Dola, so you can see it also yourself. Thank you to everyone, is Sarah Smith saying, yeah, it's time now for a break, and then at 7 o'clock, at least for me 7 o'clock, this mingling session. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you tomorrow also. Bye.
Thank you.
So just a final word from me. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much to the speakers. We've heard so many excellent presentations, and I'm completely inspired by all the different thoughts. It's a pity that we now cannot walk outside of the conference room and have a coffee together and exchange a little bit more. I would like to invite the people that are still hanging around. If you have questions for the speakers, you can email them to comcol.secretary@gmail.com, and we will make sure to forward these to the speakers. If you are feeling a little bit still into the movement, get a drink and join us for a little bit of museum speed dating to get to know a little bit more of the participants that are with us today. And hopefully you will tune in tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.